If you have just picked up a brand spanking new Sony Alpha camera and you want a step-by-step follow-along guide for how I set up my Sony cameras to get the best out of shooting both photo and video, then you've come to the right place. Hey, I'm Pat K, a travel photographer and Sony digital imaging ambassador based here in Tokyo, Japan. And naturally, as a part of the job, I find myself having to set up cameras from scratch quite often. So over the years, I've really dialed in my choices that are perfect for me as someone who shoots both photo and video equally. And I want to share my settings and how I set up my cameras step by step with you in this video. Now, this video applies to the newer menu system that Sony has released from late 2021. So it'll cover any camera released since then and a few older ones with some software updates as well. For reference, the Alpha 1 and the Alpha C 7C series, the A7R5, which is what we'll be using today, the A7 IV, the A7S3 after an update, and even cameras like the FX3 and the FX30 are all somewhat similar. So if you have any one of those or any models around that, then you'll be able to follow along just fine. All right, let's jump in. All right, so for context, I am a photo first and then a video shooter, but I do both about half, pretty equally. But the thing with the Sony menus is that they kind of change contexts depending on whether you're in photo mode or video mode. So on the A7R Mark V here on the top dial, there's like a lower section on it, which says, photo, video, and then S&Q. For this general setup, what I typically go for is setting everything up in photo mode as manual. And then within the menus, I can start to change things for video as well. And typically I have my video settings being very close to my photo settings. So I always start in photo and then finish it up that way as well. But let's jump into the camera settings. So right here we have the menu options. So before we get too deep into it all, we can go down to the setup, which is the last option on the left here. And we can actually go into reset and save settings. So if you say, for example, you just want to follow along and you don't want to get rid of your settings or anything like that, or, you're not starting from fresh, then you can go and save and load settings and save your existing settings here so that you can pull them up at a later time if you want to. What I have already done is I've gone into settings reset, and then I've gone camera settings reset just to start everything from baseline, nice and easy. But essentially the video will be the same process that I take for every camera setup, which is I literally just go down this menu one by one, going through every single last thing and tweaking it all until I'm happy with everything and I've made sure absolutely everything has been covered. So that's what we will do in this video as well. I do skip the first two though, because the My Menu settings I tend to do at the end, and we'll do that as well in this video too. The second option here, which is main, just shows you all of your settings that are currently reset. So we will start with this one, which is the shooting menu. This is where all the fun stuff begins. I usually leave this as JPEG. HEIF is a format that is extremely efficient. But unfortunately, the support for it isn't too great. So I tend to leave mine in JPEG if I'm ever shooting in JPEG, which actually is like almost never. The next one is image quality settings. So this gives up a table kind of option here. And the first one we have is file format. And usually I actually just shoot RAW. In the past, I used to shoot RAW and JPEG. You should always be shooting RAW as a very, very minimum, in my opinion. But yeah, I post-process everything, literally every photo that I ever do. Any photo that you've ever seen, unless it's like an Instagram story or something like that, it has had some level of processing done to it. So for me, I go for RAW, and then RAW file type will be compressed, uncompressed, and then with these new menus, so sometimes depending on the model, you might not have all of these options, but the A7R5 has lossless compressed, so large, medium, small. For me, typically compressed or lossless compressed is the best. Uncompressed, I did a image quality test a long time ago between compressed and uncompressed, and it's almost twice the size, but the image quality is barely, like, it's imperceivable. So for me, the space saving of compressed is most certainly very efficient. I tend to these days go for lossless compressed L. That gives me the most performance to size benefit, although compressed is still pretty good as well. JPEG quality doesn't really matter for me because I never shoot in JPEG, but if, for example, I did shoot in JPEG, I would go extra fine, and then I would go 60 megapixels because we're shooting with the A7R5 here, so we'll just stick to the largest that it can go. For now, we will go back to RAW though, and then the rest of the options are dashed out. On the bottom left, we have rec media settings or recording media settings. And in here, we can choose where the things that we're shooting go to, depending on the cards we want to use. So on the first line here, we have photo recording media. So I send that to slot 1 in my SD card, which is fine. And then my video to slot 2. And then I auto switch media. So what this means is if one of those card slots is just full and you're in the heat of shooting, whether that's photo or video, the camera will automatically switch to the emptier card slot and keep recording in that instance. In either one of these slots, we have the ability to actually change not only the slot number, but do a simultaneous recording or a sort recording as well. If you want that extra redundancy, say you're shooting something that is extremely mission critical, like a wedding or something like that, perhaps you might want to do a simultaneous recording so that you can record everything, photo and video, to both of the cards at the same time in the event that one card fails. For me, I always tend to overspend on my cards. That doesn't necessarily always guarantee highest quality, but I've only ever had 2 cards fail on me in my entire photography career. I know it's like one of those 1 in a million chances, you never know, but I tend to just have this set up and it works fine for me. I also have a workflow process where at the end of every single day after I've shot at the end of the day, I'm super disciplined in uploading or dumping all of my footage onto my computer and doing it straight away at the end of the day religiously. It doesn't sit there. I'm always moving the data onwards, and that's why I feel okay with only one slot at a time. Now, the next setting we'll go through here is aspect ratio. So this by default is 3:2, which uses the full extent of the sensor. And this is usually useful for if you shoot JPEG and you want something that is specific out of camera. So say, for example, you are using like a photo camera as a video camera as well, and you want your JPEGs to look like cinematic stills from a video, then you might want to choose 16:9 or something like that in this instance. I just go for 3:2 so that I can get the maximum amount of information off the sensor. The next option is file format for video specifically. So we have a bunch of options here. Yours will look different depending on the model of camera that you choose. For me, I'm always 4K. I'm always shooting in 4K. For me, the most optimum, even though I have the option to do it, is XAVCS in 4K. The HS version is good, but I tend to not use it just for the size versus the performance kind of value. And I don't ever shoot in 8K at all. So for me, this setting is totally fine. Now, before we move on any further, I have a camera that was bought in Australia. In Australia, we use the PAL setting for recording video and such. But I always like to use the NTSC setting so that I can record in, 120 frames a second or 60 frames a second or something like that. Something that I tend to work with a lot more often. I never shoot in, 25 frames a second, for example. So I always go down to here in the setup page, and then in area and date, we go into NTSC and PAL selector. And usually here it will say, change to NTSC. I've already changed it because I had this camera used before, but you can change it from NTSC to PAL in this option. So I make sure that it's NTSC. Now coming back to the shooting page, the next option is movie settings. And then here we can choose our frame rates and our record settings. So this is what it looks like for users who use NTSC. For me, I tend to shoot in 24 frames a second as my kind of baseline video setting. That might not be the same for you. Some people like to shoot for 30. Some people like to shoot 60 all of the time so that they can then slow it down in post and all of those kind of things. For me, when I'm shooting normally, I shoot in 24, and then I use the S&Q setting for slow motion footage later on, because the camera kind of does everything and it speeds up my workflow quite a lot. So I tend to use 24p. Now the next one we have is the record settings, which I tend to go with the highest setting for, which is 100 megabits 422 10-bit, like that. And that gives me the most amount of flexibility when it comes to color in post-production. It gives you the most amount of color space to work with. And for me, that's super, super valuable. The next setting is APS-C Super 35 shooting. I leave this on auto just because sometimes I use the 10 to 20, I think, APS-C lens, and I like that it changes automatically. But, your mileage can vary. Some people like to deliberately turn this on and off if they, just because they want the control. I just leave it as auto. Long exposure noise reduction. So this is where when you take a long exposure on your camera, the camera will automatically, after you've shot it, go and do noise reduction in camera. For me, I like to do my noise reduction out of camera. And so I have this as off. And I also don't like having to wait for the camera to do the noise reduction after every single long exposure shot that you take. So I leave this off. The next one is high ISO noise reduction. So I tend to leave this as normal. This doesn't affect the image too much, and there is no time penalty for having it as normal. So I just leave it as normal anyway, just from a workflow perspective. That works for me. And then we have HLG, which is great at because we aren't using HLG. The color space is sRGB or Adobe RGB. I use sRGB all of the time because, Instagram is sRGB. My MacBook outputs is sRGB. I try and meld the color spaces at the very end of the workflow into sRGB so that everything looks consistent across every single device. The next option in this first bit here is the lens compensation. So this is compensation for shading and chromatic aberration and distortion. When you put a lens on a camera, the camera automatically does some of the compensation for you. Super useful. I never turn this off ever. I always leave it all on auto and usually all on. So moving on. Next is format, which just formats your cards. Very simple. We will use that as a my menu item later on in the video because I format my cards a lot and that's useful for me. The next one is rec media settings, which we've already covered previously in the quality section. The next one is recover image database, which I never use, but if you do need to recover the database, that's what it's for. The next one is display media info. Never touch that as well. And then we move on to file and then all of the file settings that we have here as well. So under file and folder settings, I leave mine as series. Force file number reset. I typically don't ever change this unless you kind of have an importance in terms of your organization for how your file numbers are specifically organized. You can do this here. I don't tend to do this because I tend to do this other thing here, which is set file name, where I will change the first three letters of the file names that come out of every single one of these cameras so that they're all different, so that I know which images come out from which cameras, because I'm most commonly using multiple cameras at the same time. If I'm like shooting a campaign or I'm shooting seriously or whatever, I'll be having two bodies active and two lenses, two contrasting lenses active at the same time. So I typically need to know which shots come out of which cameras, and this makes it easy. In this case, what we'll do is we'll get rid of the DSC, and then we will go with 7R5. And you have to use 3 digits here, or 3 letters. But I typically use the last 3 of any one of the cameras. So whether it's the A7CR or the Alpha 1 or whatever, just so that I know which camera it is shot out of, and then it gives you a little bit of a preview as to what that might look like. The next is folder name. I typically go with standard form because I like the way that's formatted. You could also go date form if you like as well. And that's it. So the next one is creating a new folder. If you want a new folder every time you're shooting, you can just create a new folder for that project or for that day or whatever the case may be. The next one is IPTC info. I don't ever do anything here. Copyright info is something that I do, and I go copyright info on, and then I go set photographer, and then I just have PK, my initials. I usually go Pat K, but for the sake of this video, it's a bit long to type. So what that does is it will embed the copyright info into the metadata of your images. The last one here in file is write serial number. I always leave this as off. And then we have a whole bunch of like shooting mode settings. So camera set memory. This is for if you want to change the settings based on the mode dials that you have as presets. So say, for example, you have, you want your number 1 to be, I don't know, like a slow shutter kind of look, so that you can, if you're doing street photography, for example, you can do your setting normally on like M or A or whatever. And then you can quickly go to 1 when you want to do like a slow shutter panning shot, which requires completely different settings. Or you can have, number 2 as like your long exposure settings, just so that you don't have to rack the shutter all the way every single time when you're doing super, super long exposures, right? And so 1, 2, 3 here stays on the camera, and then M1 to 4 stays on your memory card. So you can always change them around and bring them to different cameras and what have you. The next option here is memory recall media, which you can select the slot that the settings are based on in the card. And then the next one is register custom shoot set. I don't ever have a shoot set that I use. So basically this is like, you can assign a whole bunch of different settings and then use a single button to bring up those settings all at once. I never find the use for it. I always like to just, rack shutter speed, or I'm always in a setting that is optimum for me anyway, so I never touch that. Now the next one is drive mode, and this is very highly dependent on your scenario and what you're shooting. As a default, if I'm not doing anything special, I will go into drive mode, continuous shooting, and actually put that into low. That is typically the one that I use. Bracket settings, I never use brackets almost ever. If you're a landscape photographer, then this is where you would want to come to use specific settings for your bracketing. Interval shoot function is where you have your settings for interval shooting or time lapses, hyperlapses, etc. We're not doing that at this point in time, but if you ever do want to do that, then you go into interval shooting here, and then you press on, and then the next time you press the shutter button, all of these settings will then go and be operable. Typically, you want your number of shots to be extremely high, something like 1,000 or whatever, and it tells you the intervals and the shooting time based on those intervals and so on and so forth. And then the last one is pixel shift multi-shoot. So this is where the camera takes a whole bunch of high resolution images just by slightly shuffling the sensor around. Again, this is the same thing as interval shoot function. As soon as you press, what setting you want, it will go and do the thing for you. The next one is shutter and silent. So silent mode settings. I'm always shooting loud. I don't like shooting silent on any camera except for the A1, just because of the way LED lights work and, rolling shutter and all that kind of stuff. So I'm typically on off for all of this stuff. Shutter type, mechanical shutter, same thing. If you're doing a silent mode, it will be using electronic shutter. So I always use mechanical shutter. E front curtain shutter on. And then all of these enable, and then we go into anti-flicker settings. So sometimes I actually come back to this quite often if I'm shooting video. So if you see any flickering in your video, you can actually change this to on, and then go variable shutter on. And then when you're actually going to shoot, you can see 256 here. I can change all of these denominations down really finely. So, if we go all the way down to, let's say, 1/25 of a second or something like that, I can change the increments that it's happening in. So this is super useful if you are, shooting in LED lights and it's not exactly, pulsing at the same rate that your camera is trying to pull out when it's under shooting conditions. You can change the variable shutter here. For now, I will just flick these to off because we're not using that currently. Steady shot on, always. Steady shot adjustment, auto, always. Pretty self-explanatory here. Next section is shooting zoom. So this is really useful for if you have like a power zoom lens or something like that. You can change the speed to which it zooms in when you go and digitally zoom for that. I use the 1635 power zoom quite a bit, and I tend to slow the zoom down a little bit, and I do that through this function here. The next one is shooting display, grid line display. I always have this on. This is a personal preference thing, and I always have rule of thirds grid. I find the other grids like diagonal and square grid to be just absolutely chaotic, and I can't even see what I'm doing. But I do like having the rule of thirds on there because I use that quite often, if not for, 80% of the shots that I do, I'm usually shooting it on a rule of thirds somewhere, so it's useful for me. Live view display, I usually have this as on because I like to see what I'm doing in real time. And then I leave these to the defaults as well. And then we get into all of the exposure and color settings. So for bulb timer settings, I have off. This is when you want to specifically use the bulb setting, which is all the way to the left. So we're not using that right now, so that's fine. ISO, this is where you can have a range for your ISO values. I'm typically at between 100 or the very lowest that it can go depending on the camera. And depending on the camera, that will be what I'm setting my highest or maximum value to. For this camera, the A7R Mark V, 12,800 is getting there. I'm typically actually at around 16,000 or 20,000 ish. For the Alpha 1, I'm way up to about 51,200. Or any of the S series, I'm also around there as well. And that just allows the camera to change those values for you because I use ISO auto almost exclusively. So yeah, the next one is ISO range limit. So this is where you can set your extended ISO values. So if you do find yourself needing that extra stop or two at the low end or the high end, you can unlock those limits here. And so by default, we have ISO 50. And so that's 1, 2, 3. So one full stop underneath ISO 100. And then, yeah, we have an extreme range. So you can artificially kind of prohibit yourself from going outside of the range here if you want. I just tend to leave mine as default and then manually go and change the values in ISO auto anyway. ISO auto min shutter speed is for the semi-auto modes like aperture priority, so that's grayed out since we're on manual. Exposure compensation, so typically I'm on either 0, but most likely a little bit under. On all Sony cameras, I'm usually at least 0.03 under. I'm always shooting underexposed. I like the dark contrasty look, but I also like to protect the highlights where I can. So most of the time I'm in 0.7, 0.3, rarely 1. I think that's a little bit too much depending on the scenario, but as a general, let's just get the setup and move on kind of thing, 0.7 is where I'm usually at. The next one is exposure standard adjust. And this is something you shouldn't really be changing most of the time. It's the way to change the camera's way of determining where 0 is. So if you permanently want to change that to a different setting, then you can do that here. I just leave it from factory and then do all the adjustments myself. When it comes to metering, I honestly love the default modes. So I'm always on multi. I find that works really, really well for me for 99% of the scenarios. Unless I'm ever shooting snow and there's like just a blanket white scene in front of me, sometimes I find the metering can be a bit off, depending on the scene, of course. So then I will go into like a center or like a entire screen average kind of mode. But most of the time, 99% of the time, I'm in multi. And then face priority and multi-metering, yes, absolutely. We want metering spot to be the center when we're using that. AEL with shutter auto. Flash, I don't ever use flash, so I leave these as default. So all of these settings, eye reduction, external flash, blah, blah, blah. I never use flash. We'll move on. White balance, I'm always shooting at auto because I post-process every single one of my images. And so auto white balance for me is one of those few settings, especially when you're editing things in Lightroom, that you kind of get for free when you're shooting raw, in that you can change the settings as much as you want and the image degradation doesn't happen because it's shooting in a raw format. This is not the same as, if you are shooting in RAW, but you're changing the hues or the colors to an extreme degree. That up to a certain point is actually a destructive kind of shift, where white balance, if you're shooting RAW, is non-destructive the entire way. So I always just shoot as auto white balance and then change it in post. I always leave these as standard as well. So priority set in auto white balance standard and shutter auto white balance a lock. This just means that, when you're pressing down the shutter, does the camera still have the opportunity to adjust the white balance as you're shooting it? I never use D-range optimizer or dynamic range optimizer, but by default it comes as on, so I just leave it as on anyway. Creative look ST, which is standard, so that's usually really good for things like JPEG and stuff like that. The next one is picture profile. So picture profile for me is one of those things that I will have off in photo, but in video I will have it as S cinetone. All right, so now we're in video mode, as you can see from the display here. And then we will go into picture profile, and then I'll actually just change that to PP11, which is S cinetone. All right, and now we're back in the photo mode, and then we can continue on. Soft skin effect, obviously off. Zebra display. Some people love to use zebras for highlight detection and seeing whereabouts it is. I'm not a huge fan because I like to see the highlight detail as it's previewed, and then I can adjust it afterwards. So I always leave this off. But here is where you turn it on if you would like to use zebras. And then focus. And then we have all of the focus things. So focus mode for me is always maybe not always, but 90% of the time I'm in continuous AF. Even if I'm shooting landscape photography or something like that, the continuous autofocus nowadays on these modern Sony cameras is so good that you can just use that for most everything. So I use that as continuous AF for how much of an emphasis between the AF or release you want for AFS or AFC. You can have it different here, and I just leave mine as standard and balanced. AF tracking sensitivity, I leave these as pretty standard for both photo and video because I like the way that it looks in transitions, and really is tenacious with how sensitive the things are when you're trying to hold on to a subject. So if you wanted to change it, you can go to 1, which is locked on, or you can go to 5, which is responsive. I just leave it right in the middle. AF illuminator, I tend to leave this off. It comes on at random times. This is the little light here that comes up as red. And that's really good for, if you're shooting in super, super dark environments, then the thing turns on and the camera can focus. But yeah, I just tend to leave it off because it's pretty distracting, and comes on at random times. Aperture drive in AF, leave that as standard. AF with shutter on. So yes, you can AF and shutter at the same time. And then I leave these two off. Some people like to have pre-AF on, which means that if you're looking around, the camera will automatically just always be polling for your autofocus wherever you're pointing the camera, and you don't have to half press because it's always pseudo half pressing. I leave that as off, and that saves a tremendous amount of battery as well. So yeah. The next one is focus area. This is where things get really fun because Sony has a lot of different options, but I love the tracking options, specifically tracking spot. And I'll have tracking spot L, M, and S. I will use mostly M because it's just changing the size of the object box, but really any one of these options are absolutely great. So this gives you the full flexibility of your tracking capabilities within, Sony's AF technology here. The next one is focus area limit. And here we have all of the different options that you could ever want, really. If you want to disable anything, so if you find yourself not using specific focus areas a lot, then you can actually disable that from the menu if you want to. For me, actually, I tend to disable the center fix because I will use either the spot S or M or L or whatever. And then I also disable expand spot on both the regular and the tracking versions, just because I don't tend to use them very much. And because I always just use tracking as spots anyway, it kind of covers it up for me. With tracking center fix, I always turn that off as well because I'm using spots. Zones and wides, sometimes I will use, so I'll leave these on, especially for things like portraits. I find these settings are much better because eye autofocus is going to pick things up very, very quickly. Whereas you have to be a little bit more intentional with the tracking stuff and the spot stuff. The next one is switch VHAF area, which is switch the vertical and horizontal AF or autofocus areas. And so what this does is when you're shooting horizontal or when you're shooting vertical, right, the AF points and modes change. So for me, I love to have AF point only so that I can, let's say it's spot, when I'm having it horizontal, I can have it, maybe it's the center or something like that. And then when I turn it vertical, I'll have the lower third or something like that. And they will be independent of each other. So I have it as AF point only. I leave this as white. I don't touch AF area registration and any of these AF settings actually because they all are fine. Area display setting I don't display that because for me it's too distracting. And then all of these, I leave these as standard as well. The next set of items here is subject recognition. So we want to leave this as on. Your recognition target, I just leave this as human by default, although you can have this as, different objects depending on what you're doing. And then the next one is recognition target select set, which again gives you the option to trim down the amount of available options you have to pick from in the menus. I just leave these as all on. And then left or right eye select, I leave this as auto as well. I leave all of these as the defaults actually because they're all pretty good as they are. And especially when I'm setting up new cameras, you know, I don't want to be messing around with like face memory and like registering people and stuff like that. Like I just want to do all the stuff and get ready and go. The next is Focus Assistant. So I tend to leave these as mostly default. I have them as on. So this means that when it's in manual focus, as soon as you start turning the focus dial, it will automatically kind of zoom in for you. I actually go all the way, and instead of 1.0, I'll go 4.7. And aside from that, I just leave it as default. Peaking, I don't use peaking ever, but if you do want to use peaking displays for like focus and stuff like that, then you can do that here. And then the next group of settings we have is playback. Not a lot of changes here. Playback target, you know, that depends on whatever you're doing at that given time. So we're not changing any settings here. Same thing with magnification. The next one is selection and memo. For me, I actually go and change these to just 1 star so that I can, you know, if I'm doing a portrait shoot or something like that, I will give these to, like, I'll give the camera to my model and I'll set the C3 button as rating so that she can go and, you know, rate the images that she likes, and then we can go and depart, and then, you know, I'll give her all the photos that she likes and all that kind of stuff. So that makes it easy for me, and then I don't have to fumble around with 5 lots of ratings. I just fumble around with 1, and that's fine. Next is delete. Don't want to do anything with that. Or edit, or viewing. I typically don't do anything with playback options as well. And then the next kind of folder we have is network. So network, I'm most of the time leaving it as standard as well. But here is where I'm always pairing to the phone, which is all of the time. And then the rest of it I kind of leave as default. FTP file transfer, I don't tend to do that because I'm not that kind of photographer, so I leave that as well. Streaming, USB streaming is a kind of new-ish feature from the Sony cameras. I tend to leave this if I'm ever streaming on any of these Sony cameras. I currently have my ZV-E1 doing that right now, as 1080p, 30p. So that to me looks the most natural. It's nice. The 4K 15p is not good. Don't use that. But in general, I would actually suggest that you use like a cam link or a HDMI capture card or something like that instead of actually using the settings here, because you get a lot more flexibility in doing that that way than you would doing it straight out of camera. So it's up to you, obviously. Movie recording during streaming, disable. I tend to leave this as disabled just so I don't do it accidentally, especially if you're live streaming and recording at the same time. If you don't have one of these, like, you know, highest end bodies, and you just have one of these, like the C series or the ZV-E1s or something like that, it will overheat pretty quickly. So yeah, try not to do that if you can avoid it. The next thing is Wi-Fi. So I don't ever change any of these except for just to connect it the first time to my phone. Bluetooth is great if you have, you know, like a remote control device or something like that. This is where you pair it. Wired LAN, USB tethering, don't change it. Network options, I don't ever change these as well. Some people like to put their cameras in airplane mode for some reason. You can change the device name here if you want to, but I tend to like the default camera name so that I know which image is coming from where. And then the last big folder is all of the setup stuff. So this is where a lot of the customization is going to happen. So area and date is pretty obvious. You get to, you know, change all the things as you would want to. So I'm obviously in Tokyo at the moment, and this is the time. And then we've already gone through the NTSC PAL selector as well. We've gone through reset save settings. And then the next one we have is Operation Customize, which is probably where you're going to do a lot of your changes. So the first one and the second one here is for both photo and for video. I tend to have all of my settings just for photo, and then the video will be honestly the same. So it's already set up in that way as well. So I just leave it that way because it's easy, and it means I don't have to move around settings all the time and stuff like that. So I don't actually change heaps of things here. For me, there's a few things that are important that I change on every camera, but there's not a lot really. So one of the big ones for me is especially on these higher megapixel bodies. So the A7R Mark V and the Alpha 1 and even the A7CR, I always need a APS-C punch-in button because I find myself doing that quite often so that I can reframe the shot, 60 megapixels down into like 26 megapixels, I think it is, or something like that, is such a great way for me to visually reframe what I'm doing. And it allows me to get images, well, be more open to be taking images in a different way. So I like to have that as a dedicated button. Typically that's AF on because I use half press for my shutter button. I've tried back button focusing and that's really not for me. So I'm happy to sacrifice this AF on button for the APS-C stuff. And APS-C mode, we can go into here, which is APS-C full frame. And then that's what it looks like. All of these I typically don't touch. This is pretty good. And then all of these. So we have, focus standard, not set for number 2, drive mode, ISO, and then not set as well. I typically don't deviate too far away from that. It's pretty standard honestly for me. The tops, focus area and movie shooting, don't touch those either. Movie shooting as number 1. On this camera, the A7R Mark V, I've got a red, button here for movie shooting recording. But on older cameras like the Alpha 1, it's just a C1 and a C2. So I actually make it so that this is mirrored to this camera and have that C1 button as recording. I do nothing for lens buttons. I know Sony loves to put buttons on their lenses and stuff like that, but honestly, I don't ever use them. I don't find the need to use it because everything is already available to me, which is really nice. So focus hold's fine. I never use it, but you can change it to whatever you would like. For me, this one is a huge workflow thing. And the most important thing here is for me, number 4. So not every camera has this by default and it varies depending on which one it is, but I cannot operate a camera without having the back wheel as ISO. So luckily on this camera, it's already set up. But if you wanted to find it, it's in exposure for that and then ISO. Being able to control the ISO when, just by twirling it is a huge deal for me in terms of workflow. So that's something for you guys to consider. And that's kind of it for the custom dials when I'm shooting. For video, as you can see here, it follows all of the photo options. And it's honestly perfectly fine for what I do. For playback custom settings, what I typically tend to have is for the number 2 or the custom button 3, I will have that as rating so that, again, I can go and, select this one rating and then give it to my models, and then they can go and select the images that they like, and I know it's rated and all that kind of stuff, and that makes it nice and easy. And then I always tend to have this number 2, so C2, on every camera that I have that's this kind of shape as selecting playback media. And this means that I can change between the cards while I'm looking at the media without having to go into the menus and then come, change a setting and then come back out and all that kind of stuff. So select playback media is under playback target here in the first one. And that's kind of it for the custom settings. For function menu settings, I tend to leave these as they are as well because they're pretty good and I don't tend to find myself really wanting anything more. Everything is located exactly where I need it to be, so I leave that as it is. And then different set for stills/movies. This is hugely important. So this means that whenever you're changing between photo and video, they have their own settings and they stay that way. So they're not inheriting settings when you're moving from photo to video or vice versa. They have their own settings. So I make sure that every single one of these is ticked so that they're all different, so that they all have their own things, because that's Very important when you're switching between photo and video on the fly. The next one is screen display settings. So this is a place where you can decide whether or not you want certain bits of the UI to appear. For me, I kind of just leave this as normal, because it has all of the options automatically by default displayed for you, and I like having the option to see everything or pressing the up button on the control wheel to get rid of everything. So if I want it, it's there. If I don't want it, then it's gone. And then for the finder, it's the same thing. I kind of leave it all on and control it via the scroll wheel. The next one is video recording with the shutter button. I leave this as off personally. Personal preference thing. I like to use the top button instead of the shutter, just so I don't mentally confuse the two. And then we have zoom, ring, rotate, which I don't have a compatible lens on for. The next one we have is dial customize. So these two top options here are the same as these two top options here in Operation Customize. They're just in different locations. My dial settings, I don't ever change these. These are totally fine for me. AV and TV rotate, I don't come from like a old Nikon DSLR or anything like that, so normal is totally fine. And then lock operation parts is off. Touch operation, I have this usually as on, and then touch sensitivity usually as sensitive. Sometimes, especially if it's like in the middle of winter and I've got gloves on or something like that, I will actually tend to, brush the screen up against my face sometimes by accident. So this can be a little bit annoying. And in those cases, then I'll come in and actually just turn touch operation off completely. The next one is touch panel or pad. I use it as a panel only so that I'm like poking the monitor at the back for my touch points rather than using it as, something that I drag from place to place or whatever. So I'm using touch panel only. Touch panel settings, swipe up. I'm not a huge fan of it, so I leave it off. Touch pad settings, I don't actually use it that often, but this is really cool if you want to use it as a pad. And say, for example, you have it up to your eye, but you're also with this hand, using the screen as a pad and moving things around. And you can change like the operation kind of positioning on the left half or the right half or whatever, if you want to do that. I tend to not do that because I don't know, I'm old school like that. But also the tracking on the Sony cameras is more than good enough to me. All right, so the next ones we have here are finder and monitor. Select finder and monitor. I leave this as auto so that it like comes up to my eye when I'm, about to use it. Brightness for the monitor, I leave this usually at sunny weather. Sunny weather only because it's standardized across all of my cameras, and I like the extra display brightness, and I use the histogram quite a lot when I'm shooting, so I don't tend to mind to exposure compensate in the monitor itself. I'm doing it via the histogram, so I can optimize for a brighter display in that instance. All right, viewfinder magnification, we're leaving that as standard, and then finder frame rate, we are changing to high. Usually it's in standard. Monitor flip direction is in auto. And then all of these options here, I don't ever change in terms of display options. Here we have stuff for like, time code and gamma display, and these are all great for, these top three are great for like video. And then auto review, I leave as off because I kind of hate chimping after every single shot, so I leave that as off. Power settings, these are all the defaults, so auto monitor off does not turn off. But I do leave the power save start time to 1 minute. Some people like to do it straight away, but it's up to you. And then this is a very important one, the auto power off temperature. So put this as high. For some cameras, it comes as standard, and for some cameras, it comes as high. So leave this as high. And basically what this does is it raises the limit for the internal temperature to go up while it's recording. So, you know, when you're recording video or something like that, the camera starts to heat up quite substantially. And when you have that as standard, you know, this is the threshold that, you know, it comes up to in terms of temperature before it like shuts off or gives you the warning or whatever. And then putting it to high raises that even further. So it allows you to just record in maybe hotter conditions or for longer periods of time or something like that. Leave it as high. It doesn't damage the camera. It's totally safe. All right, the next one is sound options. So we're getting there now. Volume settings, totally personal preference. I tend to actually leave this as the default, but audio signals I turn off. I don't like audio signals on my cameras. All right, the next one is USB. So the USB connection mode, usually I will either have it as the default, which is select when you connect or when you plug into the camera. But if, say, for example, you have a camera that is your webcam only, then you could have it as USB streaming. Or if you have it as a, you know, photo or video taking device only and you're never doing things like USB streaming or using it as a remote or whatever, then you can go MSC. We leave these as they are. The next one is very dependent on whether or not you use HDMI devices from your camera. So if you want to insert a monitor or something like that, I'm always at HDMI resolution auto. And then I'm going rec media during HDMI output as on, output resolution as auto, and then leaving it as these settings here. HDMI info display depends on whether or not you want a clean output signal to your device or you want something that is exactly monitored from your camera as it is, right? So for example, with this kind of overlay that I'm showing you guys of the menu within the camera, I'm using HDMI info display so that it can show you all of the camera options and the menu options and the UI and stuff like that. If I had this as off, it would just show whatever the video feed is of the lens that I've got on there, right? So in this instance, I'm using on and control for HDMI off. The next one is a whole bunch of settings that, you know, you just don't have to really change at all, or stuff you want to have a look at in terms of versions or serial numbers and privacy notices, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last one is coming back up to the menu settings. So it's very simple for me. All I'm doing ever is taking the first item, media, so in the first folder into media and then format, and then adding that into menu 1 into the first slot. And so then I'll back out, and then now my menu 1 is format as the very first option. And that's it. That's every single one of the settings that I go through when I am setting up a brand new camera for the very first time, or, you know, when I need to reset my camera or anything like that. All right, that was a lot, but I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments below which setting changes you do or you enjoy, or perhaps that I didn't cover in the video, so that other people can get inspired to try some new things as well. All right, I'll see you in the next video, but until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.